"You're not a guest. You're a mistake," the concierge muttered, thinking he was out of earshot, just loud enough to make the young receptionist laugh. Outside, the rain dragged long streaks down the glass, and inside, beneath flickering lobby lights, Frank Delaney sat silent in his wheelchair, hands folded neatly over a faded wool blanket. He didn't blink, didn't flinch, just stared forward like he'd done 1,000 times before, through fire, sandstorms, and nights colder than this city ever dared. His jacket was old military green, the kind that still held the scent of leather and time, and across his lap rested a canvas bag stitched with a name long forgotten by most, Delaney, F. A shadow box leaned awkwardly against the side of his chair, wrapped in newspaper, corners dented from the journey. No one knew what was inside. Not yet. Not the man at the front desk who smirked when Frank asked about the veterans event. Not the security guard who narrowed his eyes when Frank pulled out his weather name badge. And certainly not the shift supervisor who ordered him out, like an uninvited ghost stumbling into the wrong century. They thought he was just another frail man with rusted bones and stories no one asked for, until someone finally opened the box. And inside weren't just medals. Inside were ribbons and citations not logged on any of their screens, a challenge coin etched with a classified unit insignia, and a letter, signed by a 4-star general, that had never been delivered. The envelope read, "To be opened only if I'm refused entry again. Before we go any further, if you believe no one should ever be measured by their posture, by their age, or by the chair they sit in, but by the sacrifices they made to protect others, then like and subscribe. Because stories like this, they matter. They deserve to be told." Frank Delaney hadn't come looking for recognition. He hadn't even wanted the ride to the hotel. He'd insisted on taking the bus. "I like the way the city moves when you sit low to the ground," he'd said to the driver, his eyes watching the sidewalk like a map he used to know. It was a veterans symposium, posted at the Crown Regent Hotel downtown, an upscale marble-in-glass monolith that treated 5-star generals and senators like regulars. But when Frank rolled in, early, damp from drizzle and layered in dignity, the room seemed to stutter around him. The hostess gave him a look like she was trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. "Are you here to meet someone?" she asked, unsure whether to smile or dial security. Frank reached into his lap bag and pulled out a laminated event pass, with his full name, a barcode, and the bold title, "Panelist." She blinked. "Oh, well, the ballroom isn't open yet. Maybe you can wait outside," she said, already looking past him. He nodded once and moved to a corner near the elevator, ignoring the stairs. But 5 minutes later, a manager approached. Young, polished, pressed tie. He didn't introduce himself. "Sir, guests are starting to arrive. You can't sit here. We need the lobby clear." Frank didn't argue. He'd spent decades learning which fights mattered. But he did speak, gently. "I have clearance for this level. My ride left already." The manager didn't look at the pass. "I'm going to have to ask you to exit the premises. This area is reserved for guests." That was when 2 hotel security guards flanked him. One touched the back of Frank's wheelchair without warning. The other made a show of sighing. "We'll help him outside." The wheels creaked as they moved him across the floor. No protest, just quiet resistance in the way he kept his hands folded and the way his gaze never dropped. He knew what this was. He'd seen it before, not in hotels, but in operating bases, outposts. The moment when a man gets written off because of what he doesn't look like anymore. Outside, the sidewalk was slick, gray with rain. Frank's fingers trembled slightly as he reached for the blanket on his lap, not from cold, but from something older. He pulled it tighter, his breathing shallow but steady. Across the street, traffic rolled by, horns muffled by weather. The hotel doors closed behind him with that sharp, airtight hiss reserved for places that want to forget quickly. He sat there, still as stone, until a black SUV rolled up to the curb with quiet urgency. A driver stepped out and opened the rear door. He didn't say anything, just held it until she stepped out, General Marissa Eaton. 4 stars. Tailored dark blue uniform. Shoulders square. Face like thunder wrapped in calm. Her eyes scanned the street, and then she saw him. And for a moment, time buckled. "Colonel Delaney," she said, already walking forward, heels tapping across the wet stone. Frank raised his eyes and gave the smallest nod. "Didn't know I had an escort." "You don't," she said. "You have a standing order." She looked up at the hotel facade, then back at him. They moved you out here. Told me I wasn't a guest, he said flatly. She blinked once. That was all. And then she turned back to the SUV. Go get command, she told the driver. Now. He didn't ask questions. Inside, the event had just begun. Catering staff were setting up linen-draped tables. Politicians were shaking hands. Guests were laughing over mimosas. The moderator was about to read bios when the side doors opened, and General Eaton walked in like a storm had followed her from outside. She didn't smile, didn't apologize. She went straight to the podium, uninvited, and placed a small box on the table. Before we begin, she said, her voice clear as rifle steel. Someone outside your front door was forced to wait in the rain. A man whose name most of you wouldn't recognize, but whose service gave some of you permission to stand here today. Silence rippled through the crowd. Colonel Franklin Delaney, she continued, was removed by hotel staff. A Silver Star recipient. Operation Ironspan South Ridge, lead recon. You wouldn't know that, because the medals are in this box. And none of you bothered to ask what he was carrying. The room shifted, posture changed, and then the doors opened again. This time, Frank rolled in slowly, blanket folded, shadow box in his lap, expression unreadable. And people began to stand, one by one, until the whole ballroom was silent. And waiting. There are moments when a room forgets how to breathe, not because of fear, but because something sacred walks in and makes silence feel like the only appropriate response. And that's what happened the moment Colonel Franklin Delaney crossed the threshold of the Crown Regent Ballroom, his wheelchair gliding over polished marble like a vessel coming home, pushed gently by the same security guard who, just 20 minutes earlier, had rolled him out into the rain like luggage that didn't belong. But now, with General Marissa Eaton at his side, her expression carved in fury restrained only by years of practiced command, no one dared speak. Not the hotel staff huddled near the catering table, not the lobby manager who suddenly found great interest in the seam of the carpet, and certainly not the cluster of guests who'd earlier smirked when Frank was told he must have wandered in, because now, they stood, rising without instruction, without hesitation, drawn up by a gravitational pull not of guilt, but of dawning recognition, the kind that starts in the spine before it reaches the face, and Frank, for his part, said nothing. He didn't scan the room for apologies or point fingers. He just held that shadow box like a keepsake meant for a world that had gone blind too long. And as General Eaton led him toward the stage with slow precision, the air thickened around them, and no one sat back down. Not even when the general stopped at the podium, her eyes sweeping across polished metals and empty suits. Not even when she spoke in the kind of voice that never needed volume to be heard. Some of you prepared statements, others bios, and a few of you probably rehearsed how to say thank you for your service without sounding rehearsed. But the man sitting beside me doesn't need a statement. He is the statement. And with that, she opened the shadow box, revealing medals dusted with decades. Silver Star, Bronze Star with Valor, Army Distinguished Service Cross, citations no one in the room could identify without Googling. And in the center, folded like a promise kept too long, a letter with the Pentagon seal, yellowed with time but untouched. Eaton unfolded it with careful fingers and read aloud. To whom it may concern, Colonel Franklin A. Delaney is to be granted immediate access and clearance to any U.S. military function, federal recognition ceremony, or related event. His service record is protected. His legacy is not to be debated. The silence that followed was heavy and necessary. A few in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some stared at their phones with screens black, as if they couldn't face themselves reflected back. Eaton stepped aside. Frank didn't move right away. Then, slowly, he reached into the pocket of his old coat and retrieved a piece of paper, creased, faded, handwritten, and said softly, "I wasn't coming to speak today. I don't talk much anymore. But someone reminded me that silence only protects the people who think dignity expires." The microphone didn't amplify him, it honored him. When they rolled me out that door, I wasn't surprised. I've been underestimated longer than some of you have been alive. But I wasn't angry either. I've seen worse than ignorance. I've seen men lose their names. I've seen flags lowered without witnesses. I've seen sacrifices measured in silence. He looked at the front row, mostly officials, politicians, a few tech industry donors. I served with men who didn't make it back. I command no spotlight. I asked for no invitation. I just came here to remember them. That was all. He paused, voice steady, unashamed. But this, he nodded toward the moment, the room, the open box, the crowd on their feet. This isn't about me. It's about what we forget when someone stops standing upright, when their medals are in a drawer, when their strength doesn't wear boots anymore. General Eaton turned slightly, watching the crowd like a hawk, eyes finding the hotel manager, who now looked visibly shaken, his face pale with the sharp sting of understanding. Crown Regent will be issuing a formal apology, she said, tone clipped and cool. And Colonel Delaney's access to this event is permanent. Effective immediately, he will serve as honorary security advisor for the National Veterans Initiative. He will be compensated accordingly. And no veteran, anywhere in this country, should ever again have to carry proof of their worth in a shadow box. Applause rose like a wave, but Frank didn't smile. He just nodded once. That was enough. When the program resumed, no one dared continue with their slides. Instead, the schedule was cleared. Eaton made it clear Frank would lead the conversation. And lead he did, not through force or volume, but through stories told like maps, quietly, directly, like field notes scratched in between artillery fire. He spoke of a platoon that never made the news, of evacuating wounded under blackout protocols, of shearing water in places where the sun didn't set right, of loyalty not written in law, but in silence shared between brothers. By the time he finished, even the youngest attendees, those in their 20s, wrapped in suits and social media, stood straighter, understood more. And when the event closed, not one person left without walking by Frank Delaney's chair. Some offered words. Others just touched his hand. And the shadow box? It stayed open, on the table beside him. Not as proof, but as memory. And memory, once awakened, doesn't forget who deserves to be seen. There are stories that burn brightly for a moment, and then there are stories like Frank Delaney's, quiet ones that bury themselves deep, not in headlines, but in the small changes people carry home after the applause fades. And that's exactly what happened after the symposium ended, after the last guest had shaken his hand and the last photo had been taken beside the open shadow box. After the hotel's general manager personally wheeled Frank to the elevator and apologized with eyes that no longer carried arrogance but something closer to awe. Even then, Frank said little. He didn't need to, because what mattered had already shifted, and shifts like that don't shout, they echo. The next morning, without ceremony, the front page of the National Veterans Commission site bore a new banner, Delaney Standard, no veteran forgotten. Beneath it, a photograph not staged, just Frank seated beside General Eaton, his weathered hands resting on that old canvas bag, the shadow box open beside him like a book finally being read. But Frank didn't wake up early to see it. Not because he didn't care, but because he had other things to do, places to be, people to remind. Eaton had arranged transport, but Frank declined, said the bus was fine, said the morning air still felt good even if his knees didn't agree. He returned to the Crown Regent, not for attention, but to attend a breakfast they were now holding in his honor, the Delaney Round Table, they called it. But Frank waved off the title, muttering that round tables just mean no one gets to hide. The hotel staff lined the entrance this time, standing in full posture, ties straight, not a single smirk to be found, and when Frank rolled through those doors, no one touched his chair, not even the valet who tried to offer. Instead, a private elevator took him straight to the ballroom, where a plaque now hung near the main entrance, freshly mounted in bronze, and recognition of Colonel Franklin A. Delaney, for service rendered in silence, and the dignity we almost failed to see. Frank stared at it for a moment, just a beat, and then nodded once, like a soldier doing a final inspection. Then he moved inside. Waiting for him at the table were 12 young veterans, some with prosthetics, some with fresh scars, some still trying to find the language for what they carried inside, and Frank didn't launch into a speech, didn't quote doctrine or demand salutes. He simply asked, "Which of you didn't sleep last night?" And hands went up, quietly, like trust being rebuilt in real time. He told them what no manual ever had, that bravery is overrated, that endurance is quieter, and that sometimes the strongest thing a soldier can do is sit still and outlive the shame. As they listened, the room shifted again, not because of what Frank said, but because of how he said it. No pride, no pity, just presence. One of the youngest, a medic named Raina, asked him if he ever felt invisible before yesterday, and Frank smiled, just barely. Not invisible, he said. Just unnecessary. Until someone finally remembered the difference. And it was true. Because the world had changed, rippling outward from that moment at the gate like stone dropped into still water. Across the country, hotels reviewed their veteran protocols. Conference centers adopted the Delaney Clause. A new internal policy requiring front-facing staff to receive sensitivity training on how to treat guests who may not look important, but carry decades beneath their silence. General Eaton launched a formal advisory program with Frank as its senior consultant, paid. No ceremony, no charity, and each month, he visited a different city, not to be applauded, but to sit down with the staff and tell them quietly what to look for. The shuffle in the step, the dog tag around a child's neck, the crease of a paper ID held too carefully to be fake. And every time, the message was the same. Respect shouldn't need a reminder, but if it does, let it look like me. In the months that followed, Frank's story spread not through viral outrage, but through whispered recommendation, shared in veteran halls, passed through community centers, mentioned by generals in briefings, referenced by recruits in their first week of training. Did you hear about the man they left outside? And always, the answer came back. Yeah, but they don't forget him now. When Frank finally returned to the Crown Regent months later, this time for a national awards ceremony hosted by the Department of Defense, he entered through the same lobby, only now a permanent seat had been installed beside the fountain, bearing the small plaque. Reserved for the ones we almost didn't see. Frank sat there for a while before the ceremony, hands clasped, eyes quiet. General Eden found him there and stood beside him without speaking. Finally, she asked, "Oh, what'd you have done if I hadn't shown up that day?" Frank didn't look at her. Just answered, "Same thing I've always done. Waited. The difference is, this time, someone came." And she nodded, because she knew he didn't mean her, not entirely. He meant the world. The audience. The nation that remembered. The story that wouldn't stay buried. Because now, when a veteran rolls up to a fancy hotel in the wrong coat, or arrives too early for an event where his name wasn't printed on the brochure, someone stops, someone checks, someone remembers. Not every hero shouts. Some just wait until the world learns to salute them first.